Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into a concept that's, well, both historically significant and, frankly, disturbingly relevant: World War III.
Mm.
We've sifted through quite a bit of information, mainly drawing from Wikipedia, to really get a handle on what this term means, where it came from, potential future paths, and whether we're even using it appropriately today.
Exactly. And there's a lot there. We're talking Cold War military plans, those really scary close calls, current geopolitical flashpoints, and even some pretty sobering hypothetical outcomes.
It's a huge amount to unpack.
It is. So our goal really is to pull out the essential insights for you, the listener, give you those key aha moments without, drowning you in details.
Okay, so let's kick off with the term itself. It's not like it's ancient history. It's a relatively modern label. Our research suggests Time magazine was one of the very first, maybe the first, to use World War III.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is when this popped up in Time way back in November 1941.
Before the U.S. was even in World War II.
Right. In an article literally titled World War III,
Right.
is talking about this Nazi refugee, Hermann Rauschning, who just got to the U.S.
Yeah.
So it kind of suggests that even while one massive war was raging, people were already anxious about something even bigger.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So World War II is happening, but there's this immediate sense of what's next. And Time didn't just drop it.
No, they used that same title, World War III, again in March 1943.
Okay.
This time it was about comments from Vice President Henry A. Wallace, wondering if the seeds of the next World War were being planted even then.
Wow. It really makes you think about the mindset at the time, this almost instant expectation of another global conflict.
It does, yeah. How quickly they started thinking of these huge wars sequentially. And Time kept at it. The source mentions they used the term all through the 1940s, even talking about, like, the threat of germ warfare.
So the fears of the era were just getting mapped onto this third war idea.
Pretty much. And it stuck around. I mean, there's even a mention of a 2015 book review called This is What World War III Will Look Like. Shows its lasting power.
Absolutely. It's really embedded itself in how we think about global conflict. Okay, so shifting gears from the name to actual planning. The source gets into some really intense military strategies, especially during the Cold War. First one that jumps out is Operation Unthinkable, 1945. The name alone.
Tells you a lot, doesn't it? And what's wild about Unthinkable isn't just how bold it was, but the timing. Churchill came up with this right as World War II was ending.
Right.
He was deeply worried about the massive Soviet Red Army spread across Europe.
Right.
The goal was basically to impose upon Russia the will of the United States and the British Empire.
Which sounds incredibly ambitious, especially right after being allies.
It really was. And it kind of shows maybe a bit of a lag in understanding how the global power balance had shifted.
Yeah.
Churchill maybe hadn't fully grasped the decline of British power and the rise of the U.S. and USSR.
But the military experts kind of shot it down, right? Said it wasn't practical.
Exactly. The British Chiefs of Staff looked at it and said, nope, militarily unfeasible. It really gives you a sense of those immediate post-war jitters and how fast the battle lines were redrawn.
Okay, so unthinkable was unthinkable. Then we get into the 50s and the U.S. plan, Operation Dropshot. This feels much more like a direct World War III plan.
Yeah, Dropshot was a full-on U.S. contingency plan for war with the Soviets, nuclear and conventional, across Europe and Asia.
And nukes were part of it, but not the only thing.
Right. At that point, the U.S. nuclear arsenal was smaller, based in the U.S., delivered by bombers. But the scale they planned for is still staggering.
So
They
staggering.
plan to use 300 nuclear bombs and, get this, 29,000 high-explosive bombs
Wow.
on 200 targets across 100 Soviet cities and towns. The idea was to basically wipe out their industrial potential in one shot. And a lot of those nukes were specifically to destroy Soviet planes before they could take off.
And this was all pre-ICBMs, right? Before the really accurate long-range missiles.
Exactly. So the strategy wasn't about hitting specific military points. It was more about destroying their ability to make war-hitting industry, cities, a real counter-value strategy.
Chilling. Just chilling to think about planning that level of destruction.
It really is. And it highlights the tech limits back then. Nukes weren't precise, so hitting military targets meant hitting cities too. The logic was just dismantle their war machine over time.
Okay. Now, interestingly, the source also mentions some British-Irish cooperation around this time, not something you'd immediately think of in Cold War planning.
Yeah, that's a bit of a curveball, isn't it?
Right.
Ireland planning for nuclear war in the late 40s.
So what was going on there?
Well, it seems pretty pragmatic, actually. They cooperated with the UK on sharing stuff like weather data, which is crucial for military ops, coordinating navigation aids, even planning a joint wartime broadcasting service for after a nuclear attack.
Okay.
And then there was Operation Sandstone, top secret, a coastal survey from 48 to 55 requested by the U.S. basically to find suitable landing spots in Ireland if the Soviets invaded Western Europe.
Seriously?
Yeah. They even talked about sharing info on evacuating British civilians to Ireland. It just shows how widespread the threat felt, that even neutral countries felt they had to prepare.
It really paints a picture of that pervasive fear. Okay, and then NATO really ramps up after the Korean War started, right? Containment strategy in 1950 leads to bigger plans, more exercises.
Exactly. Setting up Allied Command Europe in 51 with Eisenhower in charge, that was huge. And then you get these massive exercises, like Main Brace in 52.
What was Main Brace?
Huge naval exercise, defending Denmark and Norway from a potential Soviet attack. First major NATO exercise, 200 ships, 50,000 people. Then Grand Slam and Long Step in the Med, showing off amphibious assault power. These weren't just drills, they were sending a message.
And the Soviets didn't exactly see them as friendly war games, I imagine?
Not at all. They called them warlike acts, especially since Norway and Denmark were involved. They ran their own maneuvers in response. You really see the tension ratchet up, the constant back-and-forth signaling. Exercise Strike Back in 57 was another big one.
Yeah, the source says it was the strongest striking fleet assembled since World War II, simulating a response to an all-out Soviet attack.
Right. Over 200 warships. Again, it just shows the scale of military readiness on both sides. And then there's Exercise Reforger. That was absolutely key to NATO strategy.
Return of forces to Germany, that was the yearly one, right? Testing how fast they could get U.S. troops and gear back to Europe.
Exactly. People could fly over, but the heavy stuff tanks, big equipment, had to come by sea. Reforger was the logistical test run for reinforcing Europe in a crisis, trying to avoid having to go nuclear right away.
So it was practical, but also political, showing commitment.
Definitely. Big political goals. Extended deterrence, keeping NATO unified. It involved the Military Airlift Command, Sea Lift Command, even civilian planes in the Civil Reserve Air Fleet, and these POMCUS sites.
What's POMCUS?
Pre-positioned overseas material configured to unit sets. Basically warehouses in Europe stuffed with U.S. gear, ready for arriving troops to just grab and go.
Efficient. Okay, so that's NATO. But the Warsaw Pact had its own plans, like this 7 days to the River Rhine. Sounds ominous.
It really does. This is a top-secret simulation from 1979. And the starting point is terrifying. It assumed NATO launches a nuclear first strike on Poland, on the Vistula River Valley.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, potentially millions of casualties. The planned response, a massive Warsaw Pact invasion of West Germany, aiming to reach the Rhine River in just 7 days.
7 days.
And the plan fully expected nuclear exchanges, even factored in radiation sickness. So nukes were baked into their thinking from the start.
Were they planning to nuke everyone?
Interestingly, it seems like France and the UK might have been initially excluded as nuclear targets, maybe a strategic move to keep their independent nuclear forces out of it, at least at first.
Just the court logic of it all. Okay, then we hit the 80s, and Exercise Able Archer 83. You mentioned close calls. This sounds like a major one. Many say it was the closest since Cuba.
That's right. It was a NATO command exercise, practicing the procedures for escalating to nuclear war. But in 83, several things made it incredibly dangerous.
Like what?
Well, the exercise itself was apparently very realistic that year. Plus, U.S.-Soviet relations were absolutely terrible, and the U.S. was about to deploy new Pershing-to-Bevan missiles in Europe.
Ah.
So some people high up in the Soviet government and military genuinely thought Able Archer wasn't just practice. They thought it might be a cover for a real first strike.
They thought it was the real thing starting.
That seems to be the case, yeah. And they reacted. They put their own nuclear forces on higher alert. Air units in East Germany and Poland were ready to go. The world was like right on the edge, and most people had no idea until years later.
That's terrifying.
It really is. The danger only passed when the exercise finished normally. And apparently, this scare really affected Reagan, made him think much harder about whether a nuclear war could actually be won, which leads right into
SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, Reagan's Star Wars.
Exactly. Proposed in 83, this idea of a space-based shield to shoot down incoming missiles. A total shift from mutually assured destruction, MAD, towards defense.
Reagan pitched it as defensive, right? Making nukes obsolete.
That was the pitch. But the Soviets saw it completely differently. They saw it as a massive threat.
How so?
They figured if the U.S. thought it had a shield, It might feel safe enough to launch a first strike, knowing it could maybe block the retaliation. So instead of stabilizing things, they saw it as incredibly destabilizing. It's a classic security dilemma. One side's defense looks like offense to the other.
A perfect example of misinterpretation in high-stakes situations. Okay, one last bit on military planning. NATO nuclear sharing.
Right. This is the policy where the U.S. puts nuclear weapons in certain non-nuclear NATO countries.
But the U.S. keeps control.
In peacetime, yes. The U.S. maintains full control and security. The idea is, in wartime, these allies could use these weapons under NATO command, using their own planes like F-16s or Tornadoes, which can carry both conventional and nuclear bombs. It's about involving allies in deterrence, making the threat credible.
So a really complex web of plans, weapons, exercises, all under this constant nuclear shadow. Thankfully, none of these big war plans actually happened. But the source then talks about specific historical close calls where things got really dicey. The Korean War, early 50s, is mentioned first.
Yeah, 1950 to 53. A lot of people at the time seriously thought that might be the start of World War III.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Huge. It would escalate beyond Korea, pull in the U.S., Soviets, China directly. You had war correspondents like Bill Downs saying it openly. General MacArthur warned about the Soviets jumping in if the U.S. pushed too far north.
Then the Berlin crisis in 61, the tanks at Checkpoint Charlie, that famous standoff.
That was incredibly tense because it was U.S. and Soviet tanks literally nose to nose in the heart of Berlin.
What triggered it exactly?
The Soviets basically gave an ultimatum: get all Western armed forces out of Berlin. It was a direct challenge. It led to the Berlin Wall going up, which solidified the division. But thankfully, the standoff itself de-escalated without shots fired.
Okay. And then the big one, Cuba, 1962, the missile crisis.
Yeah.
Generally seen as the closest we ever came.
Absolutely. October 27th, 1962, Black Saturday. Just an insane string of dangerous incidents packed into one day.
Like what?
You had a Soviet sub-commander nearly launching a nuclear torpedo at a U.S. destroyer, stopped only by another officer, Vasily Arkhipov.
Wow.
An American U-2 spy plane shot down over Cuba. Another U-2 accidentally flying over Soviet territory and almost getting intercepted. Any one of those could have set things off.
It's almost unbelievable they all happened so close together, but didn't the doomsday clock stay sort of stable that year?
Yeah, interestingly, it didn't jump right to midnight, maybe because the intense crisis part was relatively short. Yeah. But the Bullet and the atomic scientists who run the clock actually said the things that came out of the crisis helped stability long term.
Like the hotline.
Exactly. The Washington-Moscow hotline for direct communication and the 1963 Test Ban Treaty stopping atmospheric nuclear tests. Direct results of staring into the abyss.
Okay, moving forward. The Sino-Soviet border conflicts in 69. A reminder, the Cold War wasn't just U.S. versus USSR.
Right. An actual undeclared border war between the two biggest communist powers. The clashes near Zhenbao Island were pretty serious. It brought two nuclear powers right to the brink.
Did it change anything?
Well, they eventually agreed on a ceasefire, mostly went back to how things were, but it definitely strained their relationship long-term and pushed China towards more domestic militarization.
Then the Yom Kippur War, 73, another moment of superpower tension.
Very much so. Egypt and Syria, backed by the Soviets, attacked Israeli-held areas. Israel fought back with big U.S. support. U.S. and Soviet navies were apparently very close to clashing in the Mediterranean. The U.S. even went to DEFCON 3.
What's DEFCON 3 mean again?
It's an increased state of readiness, just below the levels for imminent war. So a serious signal. Tensions only really eased up when the ceasefire took hold.
Okay, now we get into some scary tech failures and human errors. NORAD, 1979. A computer glitch.
Yeah, NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command. A computer error made it look like a massive Soviet nuclear attack was underway. They actually started preparing to retaliate.
Seriously, how did they stop it?
They figured out it was just a test tape running on the system, but apparently there was real panic for a while to show us how fragile those early warning systems were.
And something similar happened on the Soviet side.
In 1983, Soviet radars picked up what looked like incoming U.S. missiles, but the duty officer, Stanislav Petrov, suspected it was a false alarm and basically went against protocol. Didn't report it up the chain as an attack. He potentially stopped an accidental nuclear war.
One guy making that call. Incredible. And then we circle back to Able Archer 83. Again, not just a tech glitch, but the Soviets genuinely thinking it might be real.
Which puts it right up there as one of the most dangerous moments.
Yeah.
Okay, moving past the Cold War. 1995, the Norwegian rocket incident.
This wasn't a military rocket, was it?
No, it was a scientific research rocket studying the aurora borealis. But Russian radars mistook it for a Trident missile launched from a sub.
Oh, no.
And President Yeltsin actually activated the nuclear briefcase, the Cheget. That's the only confirmed time that's ever happened.
How was that resolved?
They figured out it wasn't a threat, but the scary part was, apparently, the Russian radar techs hadn't been properly notified about the planned Norwegian launch. A communication breakdown almost caused catastrophe.
Communication is key. Okay, then Pristina Airport, 1999, Kosovo. This was more of a direct confrontation.
Yeah, between Russian peacekeepers and NATO forces. Russian troops occupied the airport before NATO got there. The NATO commander, U.S. General Wesley Clark, reportedly ordered his forces to take the airport, potentially using force against the Russians.
That didn't happen.
No. The British general on the ground, Mike Jackson, famously refused the order, supposedly saying, "I'm not going to start the Third World War for you."
Wow.
And Captain James Blunt, yes, the singer, who was an Army officer then, has also said he was ordered to destroy the Russians holding the airfield and refused. Shows the importance of commanders on the ground making judgment calls.
Definitely. And more recently, 2015, Turkey shooting down a Russian bomber near the Syria border.
Yeah, a Russian Su-24. First time a NATO member had shot down a Russian or Soviet plane since, like, the Korean War. It definitely caused a major spike in tensions, lots of worry about escalation.
Which brings us pretty much up to date, and the discussion of current potential flashpoints. Obviously, the Russian invasion of Ukraine since 2022 dominates this.
Understandably. It's the biggest war in Europe since World War II, and many experts are openly saying the risk of a Third World War has significantly increased.
Why specifically?
Well, you've got the sheer scale of it, the massive international involvement, so many countries, including NATO members, sending huge amounts of aid to Ukraine. Then there's Russia's rhetoric, which often includes threats, some veiled, some less so, about nuclear weapons. It's created this incredibly volatile mix.
And NATO's stance?
NATO's been trying to walk a fine line. Prevent the war spilling outside Ukraine, but also make it clear they'll defend every inch of member territory.
Have there been close calls already in this conflict?
There have been worrying incidents, yeah.
Yeah.
Missiles or drones crossing into NATO airspace. That missile that landed in Poland killing 2 people. Things that could easily spark a direct NATO-Russia fight if mishandled.
And Russia's pulled back from some arms control.
Yeah, they suspended participation in the New START treaty, the last major nuclear arms pact with the U.S., and they've talked about putting tactical nukes in Belarus, plus the massive use of cyber warfare against Ukraine.
Right, the hybrid war aspect.
Exactly. Blending conventional military attacks with cyber attacks on infrastructure, government systems, spreading disinformation.
Yeah.
It's a key feature of modern conflict.
And we saw that comment by former President Trump about Zelensky gambling with World War III shows the high stakes and different viewpoints. Are ceasefire talks happening?
There's been talk and some diplomatic efforts, yeah. Suggests maybe a growing recognition internationally of just how dangerous further escalation could be.
It's definitely a sobering reminder that the threat isn't just historical. Now, the term World War III itself, it's been used more broadly too, hasn't it? Like for the Cold War.
Oh yeah, definitely. Even during the Cold War, lots of people felt it was World War III, just fought differently. A Gallup poll in 1950 found over half of Americans thought World War III had already started.
Really?
Yeah. And commentators like Norman Podhoretz argued the Cold War was WWI3I, and the later War on Terror was then World War IV.
But most historians don't quite see it that way.
Generally, no. The standard historical definition usually requires actual, large-scale, direct fighting between multiple major world powers across the globe. The Cold War was cold, precisely because the superpowers avoided direct conflict due to the nuclear threat. Bill Yen, an author mentioned in the source, concludes it wasn't WWI by that definition.
Okay, and what about the War on Terror? Some people called that World War III or 13-2.
They did, but those claims often get pushback. Critics argue the scale and nature just aren't comparable to the first 2 world wars. There's this debate about whether maybe the threshold for what counts as a world war has lowered, especially with non-state actors, like terrorist groups. But that's not really the consensus among historians.
Even the fight against ISIS specifically, some called that World War III.
Yeah, the Iraqi foreign minister did in 2015. King Abdullah of Jordan talked about a third world war within Islam. But others, like President Obama at the time, warned against using that language, saying it kind of played into ISIS's own propaganda, made them seem bigger than they were.
Interesting point. And Pope Francis has a different take.
Yeah, he's talked about the world being in a kind of third war fought piecemeal,
Yeah.
suggesting all the smaller, scattered conflicts happening globally add up to a worldwide state of war, even if it's not one single massive conflict.
Okay. So finally, the source looks at some hypothetical scenarios for a future World War III. Einstein's famous quote comes up.
Right. I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War III will be fought with sticks and stones.
Yeah.
Just a brutal prediction of the devastation.
Were people optimistic about avoiding it?
Mixed views. Some thinkers doubted we could prevent another big war. Others, like James Burnham, thought humanity would survive, that the basics of strategy wouldn't change, even with nukes. But then you have things like that 1998 Medical Journal overview.
What did that say?
It stressed the ongoing risk of accidental nuclear war from false alarms, tech failures, a risk that sadly still feels relevant.
And the source lists other potential future flashpoints beyond Ukraine.
Yeah, things identified over the last decade or so, reflecting ongoing tensions in various parts of the world. And there was that study in Nature Food.
Oh, right. The nuclear winter study.
Exactly, published in August 2022. It modeled a full-scale nuclear war and predicted billions could die just from starvation afterwards because soot would block the sun, causing crops to fail globally. Especially devastating for the countries involved, but also Europe, China.
Just unimaginable consequences. What other future risks are mentioned?
Well, ongoing worries about things like missile defense systems potentially destabilizing deterrence, the SDI concerns echoing today. Graham Allison's Thucydides trap idea.
The rising power versus established power thing, often applied to U.S.-China.
Precisely. That dynamic being inherently risky. The doomsday clock moving closer to midnight, partly because of new tech like hypersonic weapons.
Yeah.
And then there's AI.
Artificial intelligence, how does that fit in?
Big concerns about AI in nuclear systems. Could it generate false warnings? Could adversaries exploit AI algorithms? Even broader fears about AI enabling some kind of world domination scenario through tech superiority. And of course, cyber warfare.
A cyber World War III.
That's the fear. It's clearly a growing domain of conflict. We've seen Russia use it heavily in Ukraine as part of that hybrid approach. It blurs the lines, makes attribution hard, and could potentially cripple nations without firing a traditional shot.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. We've covered a lot of ground. The term's origins, the really detailed, sometimes scary Cold War planning, those numerous close calls.
Right. The current flashpoints like Ukraine, how the term gets used more broadly, and these, frankly, terrifying future possibilities. It's clearly a super complex topic.
Absolutely. What even counts as World War III? What could trigger it now? What it might look like? It's all still very much debated and a major source of concern.
Definitely. The history we looked at, the potential for escalation today, the impact of new technologies, it all points to a world that feels pretty unstable right now.
And that really brings it back to you, the listener. We hope this deep dive gives you context to think about these historical patterns, the risks in today's world, and what things like AI or cyber warfare might mean for global security.
So maybe a final thought to leave you chewing on, given how many times we've apparently skated right up to the edge, all those close calls, what do you think has actually stopped a full-blown global conflict so far? What are those critical factors? And looking at the world today, are those factors getting stronger or weaker?